She told my husband, right in front of me, that she would give him the family he actually deserved, and he just sat there. I've replayed that moment so many times since then. The way the candlelight caught the rim of my wine glass, the sound of a fork being set down on a plate, the silence that followed her words, that long, ugly silence that told me everything I'd been afraid to know. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My husband and I had been together for 11 years, married for 8 of them. We met when I was 26 and working as a contracts manager for a mid-sized construction firm outside of Charlotte. He was charming in the particular way that men are charming when they know exactly what they're doing. Attentive, patient, always showing up with the right words at the right time. We built what I thought was a real life. A house in a neighborhood with good schools we kept saying we'd need someday. A joint savings account. A dog named Biscuit who slept at the foot of our bed and snored louder than either of us. For the first 4 years, we tried to have children the ordinary way, then the less ordinary way, then the medical way, the kind that involves early morning appointments and a language you learn slowly, full of acronyms and percentages and phrases like unexplained secondary factors. I was diagnosed with a condition that made conception difficult but not impossible. The doctors were careful about how they said it, not impossible, as though that were a gift. We did 2 rounds of IVF. The first failed quietly. The second one almost worked. We lost it at 9 weeks, and I don't need to describe what that was like because anyone who has been there already knows, and anyone who hasn't, well, there are no words that would really get you there anyway. After that, my husband grew quiet in a way that had texture to it. Not the quietness of grief, which I understood. Something with edges. He started working late more often. He took up running, which he had never cared about before. He mentioned an old friend from college, a woman, in the way people mention things they want to seem casual about. Said they'd reconnected on LinkedIn. Said she was going through a hard time and he'd been a friendly ear. Said it like that. A friendly ear. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that grief does strange things to people, that I was reading into his distance because I was drowning in my own. I told myself a lot of things during that period that I would later understand were not true. She came up again in conversation 4 months later. He said she was moving back to Charlotte. Said she'd reached out, asked if we wanted to get together for dinner sometime, that she'd love to finally meet me. He said he thought it might be nice, that she was good people, that I would like her. I did not want to meet her. Something in my stomach said no in a way that I had learned, by then, not to completely ignore. But I was tired. I was tired of being the suspicious wife. I was tired of asking questions and hearing reasonable answers that still left me feeling like something was off. I thought if I met her and she was perfectly normal, I could let it go. So I said yes. I made reservations at a restaurant I actually loved, a place downtown with low lighting and good pasta and a wine list that required some commitment. I told myself if we were doing this, we were doing it somewhere that felt like mine, not somewhere neutral. Small things matter when you're already bracing for something, even if you don't know exactly what. She arrived 10 minutes after we did. Tall, well-dressed in that specific way that looks effortless but isn't. She hugged my husband first, and there was a familiarity in it that I cataloged and filed away without saying anything. Then she turned to me with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, composed enough to seem confident, and said she'd heard so much about me. The dinner started fine. She was smart, I'll give her that. She kept the conversation broad and balanced. She asked about my work. She mentioned mutual acquaintances. She laughed at the right moments. She made sure I never had an excuse to say the evening was uncomfortable because nothing uncomfortable was happening. And then, somewhere around the second glass of wine, she looked at my husband and her voice shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way the temperature in a room changes before you can identify why. She said she'd been thinking a lot lately about what really mattered, about how short life was, about how she'd spent so long making choices based on what was practical rather than what she actually wanted. I remember picking up my water glass. She said she knew this was a strange thing to bring up at dinner. She said she hoped I wouldn't take it the wrong way. And then she looked at my husband with something I can only describe as deliberate softness, and she said that if he ever wanted a family, a real family, she would be willing to give him that she still could, that some things were still possible, even now. She said it calmly. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. The table went quiet. I set my water glass down. My husband did not say anything. He didn't correct her. He didn't turn to me. He didn't laugh uncomfortably and say that was a bizarre thing to say. He sat there with his eyes on the tablecloth, and that silence, his silence, was the loudest thing in the room. I had a choice in that moment. I could feel all of it rising up, the 2 rounds of IVF, the 9 weeks, the early morning appointments, the way I had held myself together for years because someone had to. I could have let all of that come out. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to overturn the entire table. Instead, I picked up my fork, took one more bite of my pasta, set it back down, and looked at her. I said very quietly, "Follow your heart." I said it with a smile. I meant every word of it, and not in the way she might have hoped. She blinked. My husband finally looked up. I said I needed to use the restroom, excused myself, and walked to the back of the restaurant. I stood in front of the mirror for a long moment. My hands were completely steady. That surprised me. I pulled out my phone and called my sister. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had just happened in about 45 seconds, keeping my voice level the whole time. She said, without hesitating, "Are you ready?" We had talked about this, not specifically about that dinner, not about that woman, but about the possibility that I had been trying not to look at directly. My sister had been the one to gently, persistently, put words to things I kept refusing to name. She had a friend who was a family law attorney. She had mentioned it twice in the preceding months. I had changed the subject both times. I told her I was ready. I stayed in that restroom for 3 more minutes. Then I walked back to the table, sat down, and finished the dinner. I was pleasant. I asked follow-up questions. I let the conversation wind down naturally. When the check came, I insisted on paying. She protested. I smiled and said it was my pleasure. We said goodnight in the parking lot. She hugged my husband again. I shook her hand. On the drive home, my husband said he was sorry she'd said what she said. He said it had caught him off guard. He said he should have responded differently. He said it as though that were the beginning and end of what needed to be addressed, as though one overdue apology in a car at 11 o'clock at night covered the years of accumulation I was now carrying in my chest. I said it was fine. I told him I was tired and wanted to go to sleep. The next morning, I called my sister's attorney friend. Her name was Terry. She was direct and thorough, and she asked good questions. She told me what I would need to document, what I should avoid doing, what the process would likely look like given the specific details of our situation. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly, though not necessarily equally. We had been married 8 years. I had contributed substantially to our financial picture. My income had supported us through 2 rounds of IVF, through the period when my husband's business had struggled and he'd needed time to rebuild his client base. I had records of all of it. Terry told me to start keeping notes, dates, details, anything that felt significant. She told me not to make any visible changes to my behavior. She told me to be patient. I was patient. Over the next 11 weeks, I was very, very patient. I didn't move money. I didn't change passwords. I didn't say anything that would signal what I was doing. I went to work. I came home. I walked Biscuit in the evenings. I made dinner twice a week. I laughed at things that were funny. I was the same person I had always been on the surface, which is a strange and exhausting kind of acting, the kind where the audience doesn't know there's a performance happening. What I did do, quietly and carefully, was gather information. It was not difficult to find. I think when something has been true for long enough, it stops being hidden very thoroughly. The phone records I was able to access through our shared family plan told a clear story. The timestamps, the frequency, the duration of calls at hours that didn't match the explanations I'd been given. I printed what I needed. I organized it. I put it in a folder that I kept at my office. I also documented my financial contributions to the marriage with the same precision I would have applied to a contract review. Every major purchase, every tax return, every month I had covered expenses while he rebuilt. My attorney said it was some of the cleanest documentation she'd seen from a client who'd come in without legal training. She said that like it was a compliment, and I suppose it was. There is something clarifying about knowing. Even when what you know is painful, there is a particular quality of clear-headedness that comes from no longer having to manage your own doubts. I stopped waking up at 3 in the morning, running through alternative explanations. I stopped performing that exhausting mental gymnastics of reassurance, of telling myself that the distance I felt was grief, that the late nights were work, that the particular way he said her name was nothing. I knew what it was, and knowing meant I could plan. On a Tuesday in March, 11 weeks after that dinner, my husband was served with divorce papers at his office. The process server was professional and quick. My husband called me 17 times that afternoon. I did not answer. My attorney had advised me to let all communication go through her office for the time being, and I followed that advice precisely. I had already moved into an apartment the previous Friday. I had rented it 2 months earlier under the pretense of needing a workspace. I had mentioned to my husband casually that I was thinking of getting a small office for focused project work, and he had accepted this without much interest. The apartment was a short drive from my actual office, a one-bedroom in a building with a quiet lobby and good natural light. I had furnished it slowly, over several weeks, bringing things from storage and a few purchases paid for from my personal account. By the time he was served, my life was already mostly in the new apartment. Only biscuit remained to be collected, and I did that the following weekend with my brother in his truck while my husband was, according to his location, which I still had access to on the family plan, at a coffee shop across town for approximately 90 minutes. The divorce proceedings were not quick. They rarely are. He contested several of the asset valuations. His attorney argued things that Terry had already anticipated and prepared for. There were 4 months of mediation and then a settlement conference that lasted most of a day. I sat in that conference room with a legal pad and a pen and a bottle of water, and I said very little because Terry said most of what needed to be said. The settlement gave me the house. We had bought it together, but the down payment had come from savings I'd accumulated before the marriage, which I had documented clearly, and my income had serviced the mortgage through most of its history. I also received an equitable share of his business assets, which had recovered significantly in the years since I'd supported us through the difficult period, a fact that was, again, well documented. He received his personal accounts, his car, and his retirement contributions from before the marriage. She was not in Charlotte by the time everything was finalized. I don't know exactly when she left or why. I heard through someone who knew someone that things had not gone the way she had perhaps anticipated they would. I can't speak to what that means specifically, and I am not interested in speculating. I had stopped thinking about her in concrete terms some time before then. My husband called me once after everything was settled. He wanted to talk about what had happened, about whether I'd been planning it all along, about why I hadn't given us a chance to work through it. I listened until he finished. And then I said, as gently as I could, that I had spent 8 years giving us chances to work through things and that I was done. I told him I didn't harbor any bitterness toward him. I meant that. Bitterness requires a kind of continued investment in someone, and I had fully divested. I still live in the house. I repainted the dining room last fall, a deep, warm green that I love in the morning light. I have friends over for dinner now, real dinners with real conversations, and when I sit at the head of that table, I don't feel the weight of everything that table used to hold. Biscuit still snores at the foot of my bed. Someone asked me recently, a friend who knew parts of the story, whether I ever wished I'd handled it differently, whether I wished I had said something more at that restaurant, made a scene. Confronted them both directly instead of simply smiling and saying what I said. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told her that the scene she was imagining would have made me feel something in the short term, but it would have handed him a different story to tell. The angry, unstable wife. The one who caused a scene at a restaurant. The one who made things difficult. That's a useful story for someone who needs to justify their choices. What I gave him instead was the truth, documented and delivered through the appropriate legal channels without warning and without theater. There was no narrative he could construct around that. There were no other interpretations available. I told her, following your heart is genuinely good advice when the heart you're following is your own. I think about the woman I was at that restaurant table a lot. Not with sadness, more with something like recognition. She was sitting across from something that had already been decided, holding a glass of water with steady hands, and she didn't yet know that the steadiness was going to save her. There's a version of that night where I made a scene, where I said everything I felt in real time. The grief, the fury, the years of appointments and losses and holding myself together while someone else quietly stopped showing up. I understand why people imagine that version. It would have felt like power, but I know now it would have been the opposite of power. It would have been handing the wheel to someone who had already shown me exactly who they were. What I did instead, the smile, the 2 words, the phone call the next morning, that came from something I had been building without realizing it. Not a plan exactly, more like a standard, a decision, somewhere along the way, that I was not going to betray my own dignity even when someone else had already betrayed everything else. I've thought about what made the difference, not luck, not circumstance. I had documented everything because I am, by nature and by profession, someone who pays attention to details. I had kept records, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. The same habit that made me good at my job. The same one that made me a careful person in a world that rewards carelessness with consequences. That clarity of mind, that insistence on seeing things as they actually are rather than as I wish they were, that's what let me walk into Terry's office and hand her a folder that told the whole story without a single gap. But clarity alone doesn't do anything if you don't act on it. And acting on it, in my case, required something harder than anger. Anger is easy. Anger feels like motion even when it's just noise. What I had to do was stay quiet, stay methodical, and stay patient for 11 weeks while everything around me looked exactly the same as it always had. That kind of endurance. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need an audience. That's the thing I'm most proud of from that period of my life. And underneath all of it, there was something simpler, a refusal to do to anyone else what had been done to me. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't try to destroy his reputation or hers. I went through the legal process, I took what was fair, and I left. That wasn't weakness. It was a choice about the kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of all of it. Because you do get to the other side, and who you are when you arrive there is partly determined by how you traveled. The house still stands. The dining room is green now, a color I chose entirely for myself. Biscuit still snores. My sister still answers on the second ring. Some things, it turns out, were always mine to keep.